Hello, I'm Stan Miller, and I thought I should cover some of the very basics of beginning watercolor. Uh, in this lesson, I'm using Arch's 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I'm using a Simply Simmons watercolor brush number 8 round. I'm using black watercolor paint in a tube, not pan. I have a water container. I have a glass dish for my palette in this lesson. So when we're getting started in watercolor, the first thing I tell my students is let's just use a tube of fresh paint, squirt some black paint on here. This is the basics. Squirt that on there like that. Comes out of a tube. A pan, that's hard watercolor paint. Either it can be dried up in your palette or you buy it and it's hard. Now I cover this a lot with my students. This has to do with the wetness of the brush. When you get a brush like this and it's brand new or you haven't used it for a while, this brush is very dry. Now when you take a brand new brush or dry brush and you stick it in the water like that, we didn't really wet it. It only gets wet on the outside. So to get started, we're going to wet our brush, squeeze it out, wet it, squeeze it out, wet it, squeeze it out, about 4 times. Now we've really wet this and squeezed the water out. Now this is what I call a number 10 in wetness. I'm just saying number 10. That's as wet as this brush can get. Now that's a 10. Every time we go all the way in, it's going to make it really wet. Very rarely do we paint with a brush this wet. Run it over the edge of the container. I call that a 9. Run it over it again. That's an 8. A 7, a 6, a 5, a 4, a 3. We can't get it much below a 3 by running it over the container, so we have to go to like a paper towel or a sponge. That gets it down to a 2, and now we get it down to a 1. It's wet, but most of it's gone. And we can even get less than a 1 by squeezing the brush out like this. And you do that for certain effects. So it's still damp, but all the water's been squeezed out of it. Most of the time when we're painting, most paintings, you're at about a 5, very rarely a 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. That's about the wetness of the brush normally we want when we start painting. So let's set the water back down here like this. We have a 5 amount of water. Now be careful, if we have a puddle down here in our palette, and we get this down to a 5. But in getting our paint here, we accidentally bump into a puddle like that. Okay, this just went right back up to a 10. So if you get it down to a 5 and then you hit water in your palette, it goes up to a 10. So now we have to dry it off again and get it down to a 5. And now with a 5, when you start getting paint for the first time, or even if you're an experienced painter, you get it. I usually very rarely don't go into the top, just go into the side like this, bring some out to the dry part of the palette, and stir the brush like this. Stir it around like that. Now that's what you get with the number 5 amount of water. If you have less water, it's going to look more like oil painting. And if it's more than a 5, it's going to be puddly. So if we stir that in like that, we have a 5 amount of water. Let's make a stroke here. When I make a stroke, that's going to be nice and dark. It's dark because we had a 5 amount of water. Watch what happens when I have a 10 amount of water. I'm going to come in here, and if you want to change color, you have to hit the bottom of the container, shake it out. Now the paint is most of it's gone. Now that's a 10. Okay, now if we go with a 10, and we go into this paint like this, and we stir it around like this here, that's a 10. Watch how dark this is with a 10 amount of water. It doesn't get very dark at all. Why? Because all the paint is diluted with all the water in the brush. So we have to watch that. The darker we get, the drier we get the brush. If I want to get a really dark color, I'm going to run this number 5 over the paper towel like this. Now I go into my paint, avoid the puddles, come over here like this, and it looks like oil paint. That's really gooey. That's how we can make it won't look much darker on here, but we can get a little bit darker here because we lessen the amount of water in the brush. So once we understand how wet or dry the brush is, that's a huge thing to consider. The other thing to remember is how is the paper wet or dry. So if the paper, let's wet the paper here a little bit. Let's say our paper gets wet. So if the paper's wet like that, and now we get this, let's say we get this let's say this is a 5, and we're going to get some paint down here. We got a 5 amount of paint. I put my paint on wet paper. Watch what happens when it's on wet. Watch when I go on dry paper. When it's on wet paper, it spreads out. Dry paper, it looks like that. So that's the basics of, is our brush too wet, too dry, or is it just the way we want it? Different parts of the paintings require different wetnesses in the brush. Let me show you one technique that has to do with wet and dry brush. We're going to get a 5 amount of water here, and we're going to put a medium dark here, and that I could cover later. There's a medium dark, okay, just black on dry paper. What if I want to soften the edge of that shape for some reason? We only have so much time to soften that edge. We got to get rid of this paint. We only have like 30 seconds. Get rid of this paint, shake it off, get it down to less than a 5, get it down to a 4, and the brush lands not on the paint, it lands out here, and it goes along the edge of the shape before it dries like this, and we come on around like this here. We land out here and bump into it like that, and we cover it like that, and our brush is getting dirty, so it's not working very well anymore, but we soften our edge like that, okay? Now, when we do that, we get another edge, clean the brush out again, dry it off, get it down to like a 3. I dried this in paper towel, and with a 3 amount of water, we're gonna go along this edge and try to soften that edge again by getting rid of all our paint. That we land out here, and then we go in, and don't back up, and you go in here like that. You soften an edge like that. Let's try a circle on dry paper. Now watch this here. I have a 5 amount of water. I'm going to get quite a bit of paint here. And so I go gooey. I'm going to make a C shape here like this here. This is a good basic exercise. We're going to try to get that to go from dark to light. That's a 5 amount of water. We got to shake the paint out of the brush. Dry it off. Get it down to less than a 5 because we're trying to soften this edge. We only have so much time. And we land on the white, and watch, we're making a circle here, and we go back and forth, and we have about a 4 amount of water, and we go back and forth, and we softening up that edge. And now we get a new edge because we drag paint over. Clean that out again here. Hit the bottom of the container, dry it out, get it down to a 3 amount of water, cleaned out. And now with less water, we go in here again, and we go down here and complete our circle and come around here. This actually is an Arches paper. I just realized it's some inexpensive student grade paper, but it still works. I recommend Arches though. So there is our dark to light ball. That's very hard to do in watercolor. So the lesson today was on being aware of how wet or dry your brush is, and how we can use the wetness and dryness of the brush to get dark, get lighter, and also how we can use it to soften edges. All right, I hope that helped. That's it for today.